How can one explain this curious failure of biblical scholars to utilize archaeological discoveries, especially when the public is endlessly fascinated by these same discoveries? The reasons are many. First, recent scholarly hesitation may be due in part to a reaction against the extremes of earlier biblical archaeology, which saw every archaeological feature that could not otherwise be explained as cultic. Thus, every large standing stone became a matzevah, as the Bible describes these stones. Every flat-lying stone, an altar, and so on. The popular handbooks are filled with such scandalous nonsense, which serious scholars rightly reject. Unfortunately, this amateurism and sensationalism have done so much lasting damage to our branch of archaeology that many biblical historians, as well as archaeologists in other branches of archaeology, want nothing more to do with us, even though we have finally become rather professional. A second difficulty is the sheer impossibility that non-specialists, even when they are interested, find in keeping up with the fast-moving theoretical trends, the phenomenal accumulation of new data, and the proliferation of literature in archaeology. And the failure of archaeologists to interpret and to publish adequately and promptly does little to help. But there are more significant intellectual reasons why the subject of archaeology in the cult is neglected. One, I believe, is that many of the Protestant biblical scholars, both European and American, who have dominated the field of Old Testament studies and archaeology until recently, have a profound bias against the very notion of cult. The whole Protestant Reformation is oriented toward the proclamation of the Word of God rather than toward the sacraments, with the result that Protestant scholars generally turn naturally to intellectual formulations rather than ritual or symbol, that is, to theology rather than to the practice of religion. For instance, a close examination of the vast literature on Old Testament theology will show not only neglect of the Israelite cult, but a certain repugnance even for the term cult, which is almost always used negatively. The same repugnance, however, is seen in much modern Jewish scholarship, even in Orthodoxy, which, after all, has abolished the ancient Israelite sacrificial cult. Archaeology, however, with its emphasis on actual religious practice, provides a healthy corrective to this fastidiousness, if we may call it that, this over-intellectualization of religion, which may rob it of its true power and vitality. In any case, such an anti-cultic approach, whatever the reasons for it, lacks the empathy to bring us close enough to understand the ancient Israelite cult. Now I want to turn for a moment to the archaeological identification of various deities and rituals in ancient Israel. As far as deities, Yahweh, the God of Israel, was unattested outside the Hebrew Bible until modern archaeological discoveries place this deity in the context of ancient Near Eastern history and religion through parallel textual discoveries, including the first actual occurrences of the name Yahweh in Hebrew inscriptions only a few years ago. But archaeology now attests indisputably that other deities were also revered in ancient Israel, especially Asherah, the mother goddess, as we have seen above, and also Baal, the male god of fertility, whom the Israelites apparently regarded as Asherah's consort rather than Ale as at Ugarit. It is clear that in ancient Israel, even until the period of the exile, Asherah and Baal were not shadowy noumena, dead and discredited gods of old Canaan. This pair were potent rivals to Yahweh himself, and for the masses, their cult, with its promise of integration with nature, remained an attractive alternative to the more austere religion and ethical demands of Yahwism. But the archaeological illumination of the pervasiveness of the Canaanite fertility cults in Israel is not really revolutionary. It merely confirms what the Bible hints at, but always downplays. Indeed, archaeology only brings to the surface a strong undercurrent throughout the Hebrew Bible, the eloquent prophetic protest against the ever-present threat of idolatry. Archaeology simply demonstrates, as we have already said, that the prophets knew what they were talking about. Now let us look for a moment at rituals of the cult. It has long been suspected that the early Israelite cult may have been monolatrous, but certainly not monotheistic, that is, in the philosophical sense. This syncretistic cult can now be illustrated directly by archaeological finds that antedate most of the biblical text, and thus constitute primary evidence. A summary of the discoveries discussed above, taken together with the text in Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, shows that the primary features of the pre-monarchic Israelite cult were as follows. 1. Worship was a localized affair with open-air sanctuaries or even household shrines of the simplest sort, serving most ordinary folk in everyday practice. There were few, if any, actual temples, and there was no centralized worship. B. In the absence of elaborate clerical or priestly institutions, any individual Israelites, males at least, could officiate in worship. Anyone could build an altar, plant a sacred tree, erect a stela, or offer sacrifices, the characteristic and probably the exclusive early Israelite cultic practices. C. The most prominent rituals were simply the frequent presentation of food and drink offerings, gifts to the gods, grains, cereals, olive oil, wine, and sacrifices of sheep or goats. That is, the principal agricultural products of Canaan centuries before the appearance of the Israelites. D. There may have been more periodic festivals of a larger nature. The ones that we know of are also borrowed from Canaan and followed the Canaanite agricultural year. These were, of course, the spring pastoral feast when lambs were slaughtered, which was identified quite naturally by the Israelites with their Passover, or Pesach, when their firstborn were spared in Egypt. The early summer agricultural feast coinciding with the grain harvest, or the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, when food offerings were brought to Yahweh. And finally, the fall festival, or booths, when fruits and other produce were ripe, and whole families camped in the fields to complete the joyful harvest at year's end, followed shortly by the onset of the winter rains and the beginning of the New Year's festival, which in Israel was identified with Yom Kippur and the rites of atonement. Now, it is true that all these festivals may later have been demythologized to some extent by Israel's characteristic historicizing tendencies, her recitation of Yahweh's saving acts in her own history, as we have seen earlier. But I would argue that their Canaanite origins and their connections remained clear to many, many people, especially in early Israel. Later, in the monarchy, the Israelite cult was, of course, more highly centralized in Jerusalem and more institutionalized by the Jerusalem priesthood. But as we have shown above, the official version of Israelite religion, enshrined in the Hebrew Bible produced by these circles, is more pious fiction than it is actual fact. The archaeological discoveries we have cited make it indisputably clear that local shrines and even rival temples continued in use, and that Baal and Asherah were commonly worshipped down to the very end of the monarchy. Monotheistic Judaism was a product of the exile, not earlier, as both the Bible itself and Jewish tradition strongly suggest. Until then, the ancient fertility cults of Canaan held powerful sway, and indeed all the old gods and goddesses of ancient Canaan survived all the way into Persian and even later times, finally reincarnated in the familiar deities of Greece and Rome. Thus, El is Kronos, Baal is Zeus, Asherah is, of course, Aphrodite, Anat is Athena, and so on. Now, lastly, we will look for a moment at the continuity of Israelite with Canaanite religion. The similarities of Israelite religion to the religions of Greater Canaan have long been known, and indeed they are assumed by one strand of tradition in the Hebrew Bible. But the degree of affinity and of actual continuity with Canaan has been minimized, I think, by the tendency of scholars, both Jewish and Christian, to stress the uniqueness of ancient Israel. Recent archaeological discoveries, however, redress the balance by emphasizing that in terms of material culture and the behavior it reflects, there was very little distinction between Canaanite and Israelite religion, at least in practice. The rituals were virtually the same. And even if we assume that the Israelite Yahwistic theology was an innovation, and that is not always evident. Yet archaeology contributes more than simply the observation of continuity, valuable though that may be. After all, the illumination of the Canaanite background merely confirms what we had suspected already from certain texts in the Hebrew Bible. The new archaeology excels, however, in going beyond mere verification to lay the foundation for an altogether new and perhaps truly radical approach to the study of Israelite religion. Modern archaeology does so first by its potential for documenting what we called earlier the ecology of change. That is, by reconstructing the larger cultural and material setting in which Israel's emergence in Canaan can be elucidated as a distinctive social and economic reality, not merely a religious movement, and not simply assumed, as some do, that it was all supernatural. Again, let me quote Norman Gottwald's recent Tribes of Israel, whose approach to early Israel I have claimed is so congenial to modern archaeologists. Gottwald says, Yahweh and his people Israel must be demystified, de-romanticized, de-dogmatized, and de-idolized. Only as we carry through this sociological demythologization of Yahwistic faith and of its Jewish and Christian derivatives will we ever be free to align heart and head to combine theory and practice. Second, modern archaeology begins to give Israelite ethnicity a real definition, both in terms of distinctive material culture traits and the patterns of behavior they may reflect, not least of all religious behavior. Here, archaeological research is only in its infancy, but as we have shown above, in looking at the early Israelite villages, we have made a promising beginning. Yet, above all, the limitations of our inquiry through archaeological investigations alone must constantly be kept in mind. Throughout these 3 lectures, I have stressed how archaeology may illuminate the events, historical and otherwise, upon which Israelite history and religion are based. But I have also argued that archaeology cannot confirm the ancient religious meaning of those events, nor can it create modern faith. As a concluding example, let us suppose that we were to choose a Canaanite site in central Palestine that can be positively identified as one of the principal cities said by the book of Joshua to have been destroyed by the incoming Israelites. We then excavate there, and we discover a heavy destruction layer which we can date indisputably using modern methods to around 1200 BC. Immediately above the ruins, we find a new occupation layer with a different style of houses, pottery, burial customs, and overall material culture, clear evidence, it would seem, of the appearance of a new ethnic group. Finally, since this is only an imaginary example, let us suppose that we are fortunate enough to discover, erected in this newly established town, a victory stela inscribed in early Hebrew and specifically documenting in detail the conquest of the site, actually naming Joshua and the Israelite agents. Now that, you say, would be concrete evidence of the historicity of the book of Joshua, proof, archaeological proof, that the Bible is true. No, not at all. For the essential claim of the Bible is not that the Israelites took Canaan by military might, but rather that God miraculously gave the land to them as an unforgettable sign of his choice of Israel as his own special people. That is a theological claim, an interpretation of events. We may or may not be able to demonstrate that these events really happened, but in the end, it matters very little, for the religious consciousness leaps beyond event directly to meaning, from this world to the world of the Spirit. Claims for such truth of a higher order are simply not amenable to historical or archaeological confirmation or even of investigation. They remain what they have always been, matters of faith.